Hi everyone, I'm Allie with the Potomac Bead Company, and I am going to show you today how to do basically a peyote stitch called Celinni. There's a number of different Celinnis, and that name has kind of been used interchangeably for just a decrease and an increase in size on a peyote stitch. So I have here just a little sample of a peyote stitch that is a V-shaped, going from Delicas to 11s and 8s and then to 6s down the middle. I also have a video using crystals down the middle. And then there's also kind of tubular Celinni Spiral where you can change up exactly what beads you're using and which colors you're working as well. What I'm going to show you today is a flat Celinni, but instead of going in this V shape, we're going to go in a diagonal stitch and have the top kind of be a little bit different because we're going to use some teardrops for the top of it. So we have this peyote strip here, which is just, again, the decrease and increase in the different sizes of beads that we're going to mimic by just having diagonal lines rather than the V's. For this video, we are going to be using a number of different seed beads in a number of different sizes, and you can really change this up. This is a cool thing when you're doing Celinni. Even here is kind of a free-form Celinni, changing exactly which beads you're using and in which number and order. Here it's very structured with that V, and we're going to be pretty structured with our diagonal lines, but you can change up exactly which beads you're using. For the beads, if you do need any of these materials, you can go to the left-hand side here. We'll do a little drop down of materials. That way you can purchase anything that you need to online, and we're happy to get it for you. Or go to your local Potomac Bead Company store and pick them up as well. Just give them a call, see if they have the materials. And the cool thing with the Celinni is you can really interchange the different beads. I'm using very standard basic seed beads to make this bracelet. We're going to be using, for the center of the bracelet, the drop. So this is a Miyuki drop in a check coating called Crystal Copper. And the Crystal Copper drop here, it has that nice kind of iridescency copper and crystal with the different color flecks that we're going to pick up. Those are going to run down the middle of the bracelet. In addition to that, we're going to be using two 11-0 seed beads. I have the new Duracoat Opaque Orchid here in that nice purple, and then the galvanized dusty mauve in my 11-0, both Miyuki brand seed beads. In addition to the drops in the 11-0s, I also have some Delicas. These are Delica number 0117. They're the violet gold luster, and we'll be using those as well, kind of in the start and in the peaks of our project where it comes back down along the sides. I also have, just to throw in another shape in addition to the drop, the 1.8 millimeter cubes, and these are Miyuki brand as well, and this is the cocoa lined crystal, which has a nice almost purplish light chocolate color. Bringing in a little bit more of the bling here to match the drops, I'm using the 8-0 and the Duracoat galvanized dark coral. To clasp and to close the bracelet, which I will show you how to do after we're done basically creating our piece, we're going to be using a cup button, and I'm using the jet bronze cup button. To hold the whole piece together, we're using 0.006 wildfire beading thread, and for the colors that I'm working with, I've chosen to use the green thread. You will use about 15 feet or so of thread for this project. You use a lot of thread when you're doing a peyote stitch like this because each bead is getting at least 2 pieces of thread basically going through it. In addition, you're going to want one, or maybe have an extra on hand just in case it gets bent up, size 12 English style beading needle. And I have on hand a thread burner. Here I have the wildfire cord cutter. And I have a needle nose pliers. That's going to help to kind of pinch down the end and make it easier for you to thread your needle when you're working on it. I am working on a bead mat here. I often also work on a bead on it board, but a mat or a board is a great option for you so that way the beads are not rolling around. Other than that, if you do like glue, you want to have some super new glue handy, or I'll show you how to just tie knots and burn the threads down to create a natural stop. To get started, I'm going to make little piles of these beads in the order in which we're going to be forming them. To form the beads, we're going to be starting out with our Delica bead, and then we're going to switch to an 11-0 seed bead. For that, I'm going to use the dusty mauve. From the 11-0, we're going to go with a cube, and then an 8-0, and then another 11, and then our drops. So I'm going to lay all of these beads out in little piles right along the top of the bead mat so it's easy for me to pick those up and to continue going in my pattern. Grab about 5 feet of beading thread onto your needle and we'll get ready to get started. To get started on your bracelet, we're going to go ahead and add a stop bead to the thread. So I added a stop bead, which if you're not familiar with a stop bead, it's a bead that's going to hold basically your beads from going off the end of the thread, but it's going to come off the project. So I like to use a bead that I'm not using in my project, so by accident I don't sew back through it. I left myself a 12-inch tail, added that bead, and sewed through the bead 2 times. That way, it stops the beads from falling off. As we start doing peyote, the first row of peyote is actually going to be 2 rows at once. We're going to start out adding the first 2 rows in an even count of a number. So we're going to be starting out actually with 12 beads total in our first start of our peyote. If you're not familiar with peyote, you may want to watch the peyote video before getting into something which switches up the sizes that you're working with. The length of your opening strand and your opening design is going to determine how wide your bracelet is going to be. If you want it to be a little bit longer, you can add more beads. It will get slightly bigger and smaller, but not by a ton. To start out, like I said, I'm going to do mine about 12 beads long. And I want to make sure to double whatever beads basically I'm putting on. So I have 5 of my Delicas that I doubled to 10 Delicas, and then 2 of my 11-0 seed beads that we've added onto the thread. So 10 Delicas get added, and then 2 11-0s in the first color that I'm going to put next to the Delicas. Let all those beads drop down next to the stop bead, and we're going to turn the thread back towards the stop bead, sewing through basically every other bead. To turn the thread back towards the stop bead, we're going to actually pick up our next bead in line. As I'm sewing towards the stop bead, I'm always going to be picking up basically the next bead that is in line. As I sew away from the stop bead, I'm always going to be picking up the bead that I'm sewing into. So right here, I'm going to pick up my next bead, which is my cube bead there, and I'm going to sew back into the first of the 11-0 beads that I added. Pull that nice and tight, and that's going to make our 11-0 and our cube bead almost sit right on top of one another. Next, we're going to get ready to add another one of our 11-0s because we're coming out of that 11-0. I'm going to add an 11-0, which will continue kind of that V shape that we're working on. Try to make sure that your second row stays to the top. I'm adding another 11-0 in that dusty mauve color, skipping over one of my Delicas and sewing through the second Delica in line. Pulling the thread nice and tight. Make sure again that it stays to the top. So that way you're going to have 3 of those 11-0s right in a line. The next bead that we're going to add is another one of our Delicas because we're sewing out of a Delica. Skip the next Delica in line and pick up the following bead. Again, if you don't know the peyote stitch, this is a great place to learn the peyote stitch from another video. As you go in, you'll see groupings of 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. You know you need to add another Delica to get almost that brick wall effect. Skip over the next Delica in line after your thread and continue to the next one. Pulling the thread through the whole way. That'll pull that Delica in right along the line there. Again, making sure that it's kind of staying to the top and that your thread's not reversing lines. It'll make the start a lot easier. You're going to continue with the Delicas the whole way down the end here as we continue. The Delicas are a wide start, so you're going to have a big collection of Delicas to start as you're working with it. Add one more Delica and we're going to come out our last Delica bead from row number 1. So the very first Delica bead is where your thread should be exiting as you finish this first row of peyote. I'm flipping it there to make sure that cube is staying right at the top. As I get ready to add my fourth row here and come back away from the stop bead, I'm going to continue with my Delicas, sewing through. And as you come this direction, you'll be able to tell too, as you add your Delicas in here at the end, which at the start and the beginning is the only place that you'll have this large collection of Delicas. Other than that, it'll just be a strip, just like the rest of these here, creating that nice little diagonal. You're coming down, adding in your Delica beads. You're going to be adding 6 beads with each row. For this row here, I have my 4 Delica beads that I'm adding in. And then as I come out the last Delica, having added in that 4th bead, you can see that the next bead that I need to add to continue with my diagonal line is my 11-0 seed bead in that dusty mauve. So then through that dusty mauve bead that's already there, I'm going to be sewing into the cube, so I know to keep with that diagonal. I want to add a cube and sew off to the end of the project. As I come now to do my 5th row, I get to reverse back towards the stop bead, and I get to add my next style of bead. So this is my 8-0 seed bead that I get to add on, and then sew back through the cube. When I'm going through the stop bead, I'm going to add whatever bead I'm sewing out of. So I'm coming out of a cube and I add a cube to continue the line. As you continue to add, you'll start to notice exactly which bead needs to come next because you want to continue that diagonal line. I'm exiting out of an 11-0, so I add an 11, and that brings me to my next Delica grouping. I already have 3 beads on this grouping here, so I know that I need to add 3 Delicas before proceeding on to my next row. So I put on my 3 Delicas. There's 1, there's 2, and usually I hold my project like this. I hold it closer to me. I work a lot on my lap. Here in the video it's a little bit harder, especially because you're pulling through a lot of thread. Adding my last and 3rd Delica bead there. You can see I kind of flipped my project so I could work on it. If you want to, you can flip it in your hand as you're working. I like to sew away from me. So as I sew away from me to add my next row, I'm going to add whatever bead I'm sewing into. So I add a Delica, and I'm sewing into a Delica. Add a Delica, sew into a Delica. I'm going to add my 3rd Delica bead and sew into the Delica. The next bead that I'm sewing into is my 11-0 seed bead in that mauve color. So I'm going to add a mauve. As I'm coming out that mauve bead, I have my cube next, so I add a cube. The last bead to add in this row, I have my 8-0, so I'm going to add my 8-0. As I'm coming out the 8-0 then, I have my beads lined up in a nice order that I can pick up my beads as I'm working with them. For my next progression here, I want to add 2 11-0, so it's actually called 2 dropped peyote. I'm going to add 2 of my 11-0s in that opaque dark orchid color and sew back through the 8-0 to reverse and do my next line of my peyote stitch. You can see if you're holding it here, as you progress, it's going to go off a little bit to the left because you are getting bigger as you do your diagonal lines. As I sew back towards the stop bead, whatever bead I'm coming out of is the bead that I add for my pattern. So I'm going to continue on adding this row. Again, whatever bead I'm coming out of is the bead that I'm adding on. As I come out then the Delica, I'll get more Delicas on, and I add 2 Delicas here. And you'll see the number of Delicas as we get progressing will only be as big as the rows of beads that you're adding. Here, as I turn away from the stop bead, whatever bead I'm sewing into whatever bead I'm sewing into is the bead that I add. So I'm adding a Delica bead right there on the end, adding another Delica bead, and then I know the next bead that I'm going to sew into is my 11-0. So I add my 11-0, sew into that, and continue on adding the beads one at a time, going through that last row that you just added, adding on the appropriate beads. As I come out my 8-0 seed bead, I want to add my 2 11-0s because I'm doing 2 drop for those 11-0s, and sew through the 2 11-0s that are already there. Coming out the end then, you can see how it's fitting, and I get ready to add my drops. The drops can vary a lot in the size of the top of the drop, so what we're going to do to basically make up for that is I'm going to add a Delica bead and a drop and a Delica bead. So back then to start the next row through those 2 11-0 seed beads. Where the drop is actually going to be a 3-drop peyote because we're using 3 beads. Coming out then, sewing towards the stop bead, I'm using whatever beads my thread is coming out of. I'm going to continue on then, building these diagonal rows by adding in the beads, whatever I'm coming out of, and then on the opposite side, we're going to add whatever beads I'm sewing into. So I'm going to go down the row here and come back up and catch you when we're getting ready to add our drop. So I've gotten to the end here, adding in that 3-drop progression, and I'm coming out my last Delica bead right after my drop, and I'm getting ready to turn back and come the opposite direction. I've added my progression of all of my beads, and now what I'm going to do is basically go in reverse order. So I'm going to start going backwards. So after my drop here, I'm going to add my 2 11-0 seed beads and then sew through the next progression of that drop, Delica drop, which is going to make the drops sit up, which is the effect that we want. So you're going to add your 2 seed beads and then sew through that next little drop section. As you're coming out the drop section, you want to add more drops. And again, just think of the Delicas as being part of the drops, not really their own independent peyote stitch. Stitch through then the 2 11-0s in that orchid that are there, and then continue on with your peyote stitch, adding the orchid in groups of 2, and continuing on down to the very end, where we're going to finish up our 11-0 line. So again, we're sewing back towards the stop bead, so we're adding whatever bead we're coming out of in our line. And as I get to the end, the last bead in this stitch is going to be my 11-0 seed bead. I sew through the Delica, and for now, the Delicas get a little bit of a break. As I turn back the other way, I'm adding the bead that I'm sewing into and completing that first line of my 11-0s. Adding my next cube there. Sewing back through and making sure to continue that line. So unlike the V bracelet, where we kind of switch gears then and the beads come back, we're going to finish each one of these lines before we add the Delicas at the very end. As I'm coming out here towards the back, I'm sewing into my drop mix, which is my Delica, my drop, my Delica, and then sew into that next Delica collection. As we do this and it curves, those drops will all kind of pop to the top, which is the effect that we want. Make sure to sew through all 3 of those beads, and then go back to your connecting line here, adding your 2 orchid and sewing through the 2 orchid on the ends. Again, when I get to the end, it's time again for me to switch my bead and go back down the line, adding in my 8-0 and then reversing. Whatever bead I'm sewing out of then, because I'm headed towards my stop bead, is the bead that I add. Pick up that last little drop section and continue down the line. So now basically we are reversing the order and the direction that we did on the original go round. So the pattern continues to be the same with adding and subtracting, or I'm sorry, adding either before or after the beads that you're coming out of to make those longer strips. I'm going to continue on with this line, adding my beads and making sure that my lines end. So as I get to this next section here, kind of pushing those drops up top, as I get to the next section here, I'll actually be ending my cubes and have my last cube on for this diagonal line. As the peyote stitch progresses, you can see kind of that almost fun drop shape going on. And you can see those pink 8-0s really kind of holding up and being the foundation for that fun drop. As we continue and we get to the end where we've gone back down the line and we're about to add the Delicas, we're going to add in our Delica as our last bead. And what we're going to do to actually separate out those beads a little bit more is do about 3 or 4 rows of those Delicas when we come back. So instead of starting that progression right when we get back here to the very start end away from the stop bead and add our Delica, instead of going back and starting that waterfall progression again, we're going to add a Delica and do 2 more rows of Delicas and then get back and start the progression again. So once we get to that, I'll kind of come back to you, but you're just going to continue stitching. That when you're going towards the stop bead, it's whatever bead you're coming out of, and away, whatever bead you're going into. You can see at each end, as you get to the end of the row, you get to the end of each bead style as well. So I'm coming out of those 2 purples there. I'm going to add the 2 purples, go through my last little drop Delica grouping, and then I'll be actually at the end of that drop in Delica collection and turn around and start back the other way. So it'll sit up a little bit on that curvature, and we're going to add again in a couple of those Delica rows, 3 or 5, kind of decide as we go. And you can really switch up however many rows you want to how long you want it to be. And that'll be 3 to 5 rows of that Delica bead in order to get ready to do that next little bump up. So continue on adding the rest of your little Delica rotation here. Going ahead then into my last stitch here. As I come out the last of my grouping of my 2 drop, add my drops with my Delicas on the side. Going back then through the drop grouping. I'll get ready to turn back the opposite way, and that will be the last of my drop line. After the drops then, back into whatever bead you're stitching into. So I have my 2 of my 11-0s that I'm going to be stitching into. Then after exiting that, back into my 8-0 bead, and then my cube, and basically it'll look like a little kind of rigid bump line. And you can really switch out. I went back and forth whether or not to use crystals down that center bump line, so you can really switch out what you're doing. As I get to the end, again, I'm going to add that Delica bead in before I sew into the Delica. And then just to do a couple rows of Delica beads, I'm going to continue with another Delica to group that up. The Delicas are going to act as a divider or a spacer, so that way I have a little bit more of the Delica rows before I get ready to start my next little curvature line. So continue on, and I think I'll do 5 rows of my Delicas before I get ready to start that waterfall progression, both up and then back down. As you finish off your last row of your 11-0 seed beads, I actually decided to continue with the Delicas just to have a nice big space and finish off my row of my 11-0s before switching back to the rotation again. So you can see kind of the fun and funky spine that the drops create. If you want the drops to sit more recessed, just go right into the drops after those 2 11-0s. What I'm going to do now is start that waterfall progression again, adding my 11-0 as I get to the end, and then sewing back into the project with whatever bead I'm coming out of as the bead I'm sewing into. And then as I get to the next row of the peyote, I'll start that progression with after the 11-0 seed bead here at the end. When I turn back to come the opposite way, I'll add in my cube. You can also use this opportunity if you want. You can kind of change your pattern and make it more free form, as I had said. You can make it with all different beads and add all different bead rotation. But here at the end then I do a Delica and turn around and finish out that Delica row. And I'll end up with 6 rows of Delicas in a line before we go back into our bump. So this time as I'm sewing away from the stop bead, I'm going to be adding whatever bead I'm sewing into, which is going to be a collection of 5 Delicas, and then one of my 11-0 seed bead in that dusty mauve color. As I come back out the end of the design, then after adding that dusty mauve, and I'm right to the end, we're progressing up in that waterfall again, adding in the cube, and then starting that cube row. So it's very simple once you get the hang of it to know what to add and whether or not you're adding what you're sewing into or what you're sewing out of to get these nice straight lines. And then I like the funky look of kind of the seed beads hanging out there and puckering those drops up. Again, if you wanted to sit more recessed, you can just either use 6-0s or actually use the drops by themselves. As we progress down them, we're going to finish off our 6 rows of our peyote and do that waterfall progression back so we get our next little bump in our design and our next little wave. As I'm doing this next rotation here, I wanted to show you as I started doing that waterfall back down that I decided to make this bracelet even more unique. And also it works to show you exactly what it looks like if you don't put the Delicas. So I'm going to do every other line kind of bumpy with those Delicas and then not bumpy. Bumpy with the Delicas in, not bumpy. So for this line, I'm just going right in to the drops, not adding the Delicas on the side. This will also give you an idea then and a look as far as what the drops look like as you're working with them. So I'm starting that progression then of that waterfall back down on the opposite end here as I end these rows, getting to the end of my cubes, adding in my last cube here and kind of turning around and finishing off a lot of my lines. As I finish off the lines on one side, I'm adding the beads going down in progression on the other side. So just like we did, but instead of adding the Delicas, I'm just going right into the teardrop, adding a drop, and then treating my teardrop just like I did, but instead of adding the Delicas, we're just adding the drops right next to one another with no Delicas before or after. This will show you then the difference in the look when you decide, if you decide to do those beads with or without. Or in my case, like I said, I'll do every other, just to make it a little bit more fun and funky. As I get to the end there, I'm degrading and going back down that waterfall, adding in whatever bead I'm coming out of here, and starting that line of my cubes. So you can see that next line of peyote starting with just those drops, which will sit a little bit more recessed than the funky one that has the delicas and the drops at the top. As I finish with this second row now, you can see the funky bumps versus the regular bumps and how much wider that spreads out because they're not sitting up. So I'm going to continue now doing the waterfall again because I finished with those 11 seed beads, and I'm going back again, progressing up that line of seed beads, down that line of seed beads, and the next one I'm going to do with that funky grouping that it has the little seed beads that are raised up by the 11 Delicas. From here on, it's just literally continuing with the pattern, getting that zigzag Celinni spiral look with that nice Delica row in the middle. If you want the spirals to sit closer together, you can simply do less rows of the Delicas and start your rotation of your waterfall sooner or later, depending on when you want to do it. You can also change up the middle to be 6/0 seed beads, to be 2 by 3 millimeter crystals, and really have fun with a variety of different shapes and different styles of beads as you're working on doing this. So I'm going to continue on now as I come back to the end and I finish that 11/0 seed bead and go back down the line then, creating that waterfall effect of that 11 to cube to 8 to 2 11s to drop, back down then, right down along the row, continuing to make that peyote longer and continuing with this stitch until I get the length of the bracelet desired that I want to make. There will come a time when you need to add thread to your project, and I'll show you how to do that. So working diligently for this guy for a couple hours, I was able to finish it in length. And it's a little bit big for my wrist, so if you have an average size wrist, probably about 7 of the actual diagonal stitches is what you're going to need in order to fit the wrist. I'll show it on mine here, that the ends overlap a little bit. And I have about a 6 1/4 inch wrist that I like to wear. So it's a little bit big, and it has a tiny bit of stretch to it just because of the pattern and the way the beads are brought up in the top. If you do decide not to do the delicas and kind of have that fun and funky middle, and you just want to do the straight drops, 6 of the diagonals may do it for you. Again, also, if you want them to be closer, you can shorten up the peyote stitch in the middle and decrease it there from that 6 line down to 4 or 2. That's kind of up to you. When you do get to the end of the project, it's time to put on your clasp. Remember that we left about 12 inches on the one side that we started with, which is going to make it easy for us to go back, put a needle on that, and get started on that side. On the other side here, I'm going to get ready to add my button portion of my clasp. To add the button portion of my clasp, I also got out some other cup buttons that were sitting around. I had originally decided that I was going to use the jet bronze, but after making it, the jet bronze didn't have enough zip for me, so I'm actually going to switch here to that Topaz one. And that Topaz Capri Gold is what I'm going to use at the end. It kind of plays off that nice copper shine of those copper rainbow drops. To add the cup button, I want to get back to the middle of the bracelet here. When we started the row, again, we started with 12 beads. I want to get back basically to 6 beads to the center of it and come out the middle to add my button. You can also do a V shape if you need it to be a little bit longer, and bring your button out to the end in a V. It's going to sit nicer to keep your button a little bit closer, especially because this is a little bit big for my wrist. I'm going to keep the button a little bit closer and bring it right out the middle bead. If you do have 15/0 seed beads on hand, you can grab the 15/0s, come back through the center, and actually come out that bead there and add the 15/0s right along the missing edges along the peyote stitch. I got ahead of myself and I did forget to show you how to tie on thread, so I apologize for that. But all you do for that is right over left, left over right basically, or you can tie the new piece of thread around the old piece, slide the knot down, and then give it a nice tie. Whenever I do add thread to projects, I usually keep a little bit of the tail on, and then I'll grab my burner towards the end and actually burn down the edges. I burn down the edges separately, one side and then the other side, which balls up the thread a little bit and makes it so that it actually cannot come out of the knot. To finish up the project, I am going to sew back through the peyote stitch. I don't want any thread exposed, and I'm right there on that edge. So what I'm actually going to do is sew back through the peyote and basically back stitch. So I'm going from the last row there and sewing back along it. When I sew then down to the middle, I'm going to sew along the peyote so that way I make sure that none of my thread is exposed. I'm sewing down on this diagonal line here, right out till I come right along and out that centered bead. When I'm out that center Delica, it's time to add on my button. You can choose from a number of the different beads that you're using to add your button. I'm going to use some of that bright purple, that Duracoat Opaque, and I'm going to add on 3 of those Duracoat Opaque. Attach my cut button up through that Capri side and out the Topaz. Then on the top of the button, again, you can add some color. So I'm going to use an 11, an 8, and an 11. Sew down the other side of the cut button. And when I'm coming out that side of the cut button, I'm going to add 3 more of my 11 seed beads. Because I came out of one of these end beads, I'm going to circle around and come in the other side of that 11 Delica bead. When I do that, it'll pull the button around centered, and then you'll have that little loop there that's created on the actual button. To reinforce the button, go back up through all the seed beads, up through the cut button, and if you can at the same time, go through the buttons on the top. It makes it easier to go through right away than it does after the fact. Go back down the other side. And if you want, you can do this 3 times or so. I'm just going to do it 2 for example's sake. And then what I'm going to do is sew back through my project on that diagonal in the opposite direction, going down towards the base of the bracelet closest to me. And I'm going to actually pick up at random places and do a sewer's knot, grabbing onto one of my threads that are between, one of my little warp threads there, or my bridge threads. Make a loop, sew through that loop, and pull that tight. You may also notice I had to switch to some gray thread for my green just because I got home here to finish the video after working on this for a couple hours and realized that I ran out of gray. So time to go back to the store and buy, or green, go back to the store and buy some more. I'm going to reverse then through the bracelet, making sure that none of the thread is exposed, and just sew back through the peyote a little bit, which is going to reinforce that line. You can decide how far you want to sew back in through the project and how many times you want to do those sewer's knots. That's up to you. I'm going to go ahead on this side here, go through my top bead, through that, down through that Delica bead, tie one more knot off as I come out the end. And then I'm going to burn down and burn off the original or the additional thread. To do your burner, you're just going to take the thread burner, go about 1/4 to 1/8 of an inch left, go right on top of that thread and just burn it down, which will ball it up a tiny little bit. If you can, it's nice to actually end the thread in the back of the project as well. At the same time, because I'm here on these ends, I will also ball down this connection point where I switch from the green to the gray thread. Burning each side independently, again, will allow me to get the thread closer to the project, where I can usually, with the peyote stitch, kind of tuck it towards the back so you don't see it. And it also balls up the 2 ends, so that way we don't pull out the knot. If you want to and you don't want to have any balling effect going on, you can also leave those tails longer and again sew back through the project more, or make sure that those tails are to the back of the project. Once I have those burn off, I'm going to go back here to the starting side and remove my stop bead. Sometimes you can easily pull the stop bead off right away. Other times you need to go ahead and actually kind of put your needle on and sew back out the stop bead. Once that stop bead is out, it's time to put the needle back on that end, and we'll get ready to sew back to the middle bead on this side here and get ready to make our loop to connect our topaz button to. Once the needle is on them, same deal, I'm going to sew back through the project, coming out on an angle. I also forgot to mention that I did end both sides on my straight peyote stitch line here with my Delica beads. So just like my starter line, I finished it so that way the ends would be basically mirror images of one another. You can choose to do that, or you can choose to end somewhere in the middle of your stitch if it's for size purposes. I like to try to finish the rows if possible, but you want to make sure that the bracelet fits more than anything. Once I'm out kind of that middle, one of those middle 6 beads, I'm going to go ahead and make my loop for my button. Because I chose to use that purple color on the starting side, I'm also going to use that Duracoat Opaque Dark Orchid for my loop. You can switch it up too, and you could do a pattern if you wanted to with the 2 different 11s. You could use the Delicas. I prefer the rounded effect of the 11 O's rather than using the Delicas. For the start of this one, I'm going to use 1 11, pick up 1 8, and then we're going to pick up about 23 to 25 11s. I'm just going to pick those up with your thread and needle, kind of letting them all fall back, and this is going to create our loop for the button. If you want to, you could also do a little bit fancier and continue with that peyote stitch, starting with some 8s, then going to 11s and Delicas. Or rather, sorry, starting with the Delicas, then going to the 11s, and then going to the 8s as the loop gets bigger. Once you have enough beads on that you know that it'll fit through the cut button, I actually got excited there and have too many, you're going to sew back through that 8O seed bead with the thread kind of going around in a circle, and that's going to pull those seed beads right in place. As I'm exiting the 8, then I'm going to pick up 1 more 11, and just like we did the other side, I'm going to sew through the top of that Delica bead since I started going through and coming out on the bottom side. That's going to round that out, so it's going to look like 2 beads, then my 8 and my loop. You want to make sure to definitely reinforce this, going back up through the entire loop that you made, and making sure to get it nice and tight here, adding all these extra beads in, or extra thread in between the beads rather. Once you get it sewed back through that 2nd and 3rd time, you can go ahead just like we did on the other side, weaving the thread back through the project, doing a couple sewer's knot, and then burning down your edges. Once you've got everything burned off and your thread edges tucked in, your bracelet is completed here with that nice little cut button end with that loop fitting nice and snug. Also, keeping it nice and snug like that is going to keep those ends together. If you do want to complete the bracelet, you can also sew the button back in a little bit on the stitch, and that will kind of make those 2 edges touch if you would like to do that. So that's an idea if you do want to finish up the pattern. You can always start the loop back a little bit and start the button back a little bit. Again, I ended up with 7 of my diagonal stitches. You can do 6 if you have a smaller wrist like me, because it will just have a tiny bit of a give as those beads in the middle stretch out a little bit. Also, as you do wear it more often and you have it on more, it's going to relax just a tiny little bit, that a lot of these different bumps that were created by the drops will kind of dissipate a tiny bit and smooth out. I think the real fun part of this Celinni again is the fact that you can really use any sort of bead. You just need to figure out the progression from a smaller bead to a bigger bead and not jump too drastically from one size to another. Jumping drastically is what will make a lot of tension on the thread, and sometimes, especially if you're using the Swarovski crystals, they have a nice sharp edge, or if you're using a bugle and they may actually cut through your thread. Another idea also is to try this out with some multi-hold beads. That's also another fun alternative to use to the drops and the crystals. So if you haven't yet played around with the Celinni, whether or not it be flat or cylindrical or tubular, you can check out this Celinni idea. Give yourself some time, some beads, and just really play around with the different design and the pattern as far as going from bigger to smaller and smaller to bigger. You can also change the colors on each side rather than just repeating. The best advice I can give is lay those beads out so you can do that waterfall again, going up and going back away and towards the stop bead, making sure whether or not you're putting the beads in based on the bead you're coming out of or based on the bead you're sewing into, picking up and knowing exactly which bead to have on hand. As always, if you like these videos, you can subscribe to this YouTube channel, watch more of my videos, and give a lot of feedback. Let us know what you guys want to see, and also you can pass these videos to friends. You can also, if you need any of the materials for this bracelet, go back to the beginning of the video where we do the little drop down, or underneath the video there's always a little description of the video. There's a little button that says show more. If you click on that button, it'll give links to all the products as well. Lastly, you can also stay connected with us on Facebook in our Facebook group for beading and jewelry making. Show things that you've made, ask for advice. It's just a really great forum for interaction with other people that love beads, make jewelry, and have a great time admiring and really looking into getting questions answered by wonderful fellow beaders like yourself. As always, have fun creating and making this drop flat Celinni Spiral. And also, if you get a chance, try your hand too at doing the zigzag crystal one as well, which really changes up the look of peyote. Even if you don't do it, you can search for that too, and look at all the different ways and fun designs that you can get with increasing and decreasing in your peyote stitch. Thanks so much for watching, everybody, and have fun creating.